My name is Steve Wilson, and I am presenting a draft proposed cumulative effects assessment framework for the North Pacific Coast. This is a map output, and the purpose of this presentation is really to get some high-level feedback at a first cut of what an assessment framework might look like, just to get an idea if we're on the right track before we go and take the next step of producing a draft report that's based on the concepts that I'm presenting here today. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about how the assessment framework relates to MaPP's planning process and outputs. Then I'm going to backtrack a bit and talk about cumulative effects and what we mean by that term. Then the components that we need to have in place to have a cumulative effects framework that's practical to implement. Then I will talk about how this proposed framework aligns with what the province is doing, because one of the goals of this process is to make sure that we're aligned where we can be with the province, but to make obviously the framework relevant to the marine environment and the communities and socioeconomic circumstances on the North Coast. And finally, I'm going to talk about the potential risks and benefits of the proposed framework. So I'm just going to jump right into it and talk about what has been a key component of MaPP's work, which is the definition of ecosystem-based management indicators and targets. But one of the things that I think is really important to make a distinction about up front is the difference between what I call management indicators and the broader ecosystem-based management indicators and targets, which in general are trying to measure the state of ecosystems or the state of human well-being in communities. And what I mean by a management indicator is an indicator that tells us whether or not we're meeting a certain management objective. And some people might think of these kind of like the dashboard indicators that we've been hearing about. But I think that there's a bit of a distinction. When we were talking about dashboard indicators in the indicator workshop, for instance, we're talking about having a number of high-level indicators that are like gauges on the dashboard of a car that tell you whether or not your engine is performing well. And if something goes wrong, you take it to a mechanic and you dive more into the details. When I'm talking about management indicators, I think the one gauge that I'm talking about is your speedometer, because the speedometer doesn't really tell you the state of your engine, but it tells you the state of your driving relative to a management objective, which in that case would be the speed limit. And the concept there is we have a speed limit that everybody follows, and then if everybody follows that speed limit, that leads to certain beneficial socioeconomic outcomes, for instance, reducing carnage on our highways. Now, that doesn't completely eliminate the risk. There's a socioeconomic trade-off. If you drive more slowly, then we can save more lives, but there's a cost to doing that, so we accept a certain amount of risk when we set speed limits. And that really is the kind of concept that I'm proposing here under this cumulative effects assessment. So let's follow this a little bit farther. The cumulative effects assessment, obviously that box is where I'm going to be spending a lot of my time today, but the goal of that box is really to identify risks to the values that we feel are important. And when we have identified those risks or potential risks, then we need to develop some recommendations about how to mitigate those risks. And those recommendations can be both operational and strategic. And this is where we link into some of the other MaPP outputs. So for instance, when we're developing operational recommendations, one of the important things that we would like to consider is the work that's been done on compatibility of use and vulnerability. So if we need to mitigate a certain risk that's caused by a certain proposed development, what does that work tell us about what the possible mitigating actions we could take in terms of how compatible they are, or the vulnerability assessment of that particular value. And the idea of the operational recommendations are things that affect the issuance of tenures, permits, and licenses. So very much the day-to-day piece. Somebody wants to do something on the coast, and that requires some sort of permit, and we have a statutory decision maker reviewing that permit and attaching conditions or deciding whether or not that permit should be issued, etc. That's the very operational level. And we want to measure the net impact of all those 10 years permits and licenses that are being issued and use that information to feed back into future cumulative effects assessments as we monitor what's going on in the future. The other set of recommendations are on the strategic end. So there are situations where operationally you cannot necessarily deal with some of those risks, but there are implications for some broader pieces, and these broader pieces are really some of the specific MaPP outputs, for instance, say zoning. So to mitigate risks, you might want to consider changes in zoning or changes in the design of protected areas, for instance. And eventually all this we want to lead back into this box, which I call research and effectiveness monitoring. And this is where we figure out whether or not we're meeting the objectives, the overall objectives around social and economic well-being, human well-being, and also on the ecological integrity side, and making the adjustments to the system where we see it's necessary. So this is the overall flow of the system in terms of how cumulative effects assessment fits into the broader MaPP program.